I don't want to be prescribed something. I want to talk this through. I want to understand, why is this happening? I want to understand, is this normal? Am I going crazy? That was another question that a lot of women were asking. Am I going crazy? Am I alone? Well, no, you're not. And so I think in order to really make an impact moving forward is to be able to keep that line of communication open.
So welcome to a very special podcast episode on patient-initiated research. I am joined today by Dawn, who is one of Merakoi's patient experts, patient consultants. Dawn, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself first and tell us a little bit about your own story living with MS.
Well, thank you, Debbie. Thanks for having me on the podcast today. My name is Dawn Morgan. I am a person living with MS for 25 years. I was diagnosed in 2000, May 23rd, 2000. I started my career as an educator. I was a teacher for many, many years. And I would say around 2016, 2017, I started noticing major difficulties in standing and just retrieving information in the classroom. And so I had a little personal inventory and a chat with myself and said, maybe you should think about pivoting or positioning yourself in another direction career-wise. So I left education and I started in the patient advocacy role full-time. And I have been advocating. Well, I've always been a patient advocate since, I would say, probably about 2001, but really focused full-time in 2017. And most recently, I started in the women's health advocacy role, and specifically women's health as it pertains to multiple sclerosis and menopause. I have been living with MS for 25 years. I was diagnosed May 23rd, 2000. Funny how we remember important events. And I transitioned into women's health probably around, I would say, 2021. But I didn't have a heavy focus on menopause and MS. And I would say the heavy focus on menopause and MS came probably about a year and a half ago. And I wanted to pursue, I suppose, the answers to what was happening to our bodies, specifically my body. It came from a scare. I had to go to the emergency room and I thought, I'm dying, something is wrong. This has to be something more than MS. What else is happening? And when I started to put the pieces of the puzzle together, I said, this has to be perimenopause. There's no other answer. There's no other reason that that my body is experiencing these symptoms. And at the emergency room, the ER doctor said, well, she could help. She said, we can help you. However, this is something that you need to discuss further with your OB/GYN or your GYN. And I said, okay. So I did that. And it turns out that I had to have a full hysterectomy. And at that time, no one had answers. And that this is what sparked my curiosity, my desire to find answers and to really help myself. I started the project, this women's health project, with helping myself navigate through the uncomfortable feelings and wanting to know, how can I put all of the pieces of this puzzle together so that I can have a great quality of life. I was experiencing all kinds of cognitive challenges. I was experiencing irritability, just overall malaise. And I couldn't attribute all of the symptoms to MS. So it had to be some connection. There had to be some intersection between multiple sclerosis and perimenopause or menopause, which I didn't know that I was going through.
Yeah, so what you say is really interesting because it's usually the people who live with the disease who are best able to sort of identify questions or gaps or pain points in the disease journey that maybe need investigating. And this is why we wanted to talk a little bit about patient-initiated research and sort of to define what we mean initially. So obviously we have clinical research, which we're all familiar with, where doctors and researchers sort of decide the outcomes that matter and the hypothesis that should be tested. But I think that what's really interesting is that patient-initiated research complements this clinical research. So to find new treatments and develop new solutions, the patient-initiated research is really something that can complement this because it's patients that are not just involved in the research but actually leading it. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about your examples. I know that there's a lot, there are a lot of patient organizations who to actually do clinical research, but there are historically a lot of examples of patients. The We Are Not Waiting movement, for instance, in type 1 diabetes, where patients developed an artificial pancreas. There's a long COVID support group called Body Politic that started on WhatsApp and Slack, and that turned support into research. And so there are a lot of sort of these patient-initiated, like almost grassroots type of research happening now. And I think it's really interesting and something that maybe the industry as a whole should look at more closely as complementary to what they're doing in the clinical research and development space. Now, I'm really interested to hear more about your MS and menopause research project. Like, how did that start? What did you do to sort of initiate it, and how has it progressed?
Well, if you look at multiple sclerosis, there are over 1 million people who have MS. I believe it's 2.8 million people globally. And out of that 1 million, 30% or two-thirds of the individuals are women. And there is, and I have my notes here, there is a 30% population of women who are perimenopause or postmenopause, or even in the reproductive stage of peri to post, I should say. And I thought there surely has to be some literature out here that can provide answers. And how it started for me was experiencing night sweats and just getting really, really warm and very uncomfortable. And I thought, this can't be. I'm too young to be going through all of these hot sweats or flushes, as they say in the UK, or hot flashes in the US. And I said, I don't think that's what it is. So I ignored it, and I just continued my day and continued my weeks and months and just suffered through it. And so many women go through these symptoms, and they're attributing their cognitive slips or declines, or cog fog, as we say, to MS, or their depression, or their anxiety. And I had high anxiety. I just didn't understand where this was coming from. I said, well, I'm living with MS for 20 plus years. I think I have a pretty good handle on the anxiety aspect. I go through therapy, and this is helping. However, it was just heightened. Everything seemed to be just always, I was always on alert for the other shoe to drop, if you will. And like I said, I was having also frequent UTIs. And with that comes, well, in MS, that is known. That's something that we deal with. The bladder bowel issues. Mine in particular were bladder issues, having UTIs. Well, through my research, fast forward, I realized that is a symptom of perimenopause or menopause. Women have frequent UTIs. So when I was in the emergency room, I'm it's okay to get detailed. I'm correct here, right?
Yeah,
I think
yes.
so. So I had fibroids, and I had no idea I had these terrible fibroids that were huge. And that was what the emergency room doctor said. We can help you and help you with pain and things like that, but this is something that you need to discuss further with your GYN. And they then sent me off, and I went to my doctor, and she said, well, I think you need to have surgery right away. And I did within, I would say, a month and a half, because they were huge. And I had no idea that these fibroids and all of those symptoms were happening because of this, this reproductive challenge, this reproductive issue. And I then started to speak with her and the nurse in her office, her meaning the GYN, about perimenopause. And I said, well, do you think that I'm approaching that stage? And she said, absolutely. You're in your late 40s. And it is known that African American women or Black women do approach this phase in their life a bit earlier than Caucasian women or women of other ethnicities. And I said, okay, well, this is really interesting. I need to speak with my neurologist and talk to her about this intersection as well. And of course, there are similarities and lots of challenges from both menopause and MS. I started the Women's Health Project due to all of the challenges that I was facing and all of the questions that I had that were not being answered directly. I also looked through literature. I could not find anything that explained the comparisons or the intersection of a woman having perimenopausal or menopausal symptoms and having MS, which is our pre-existing chronic condition. I then spoke with a researcher and I said, hey, I've got this idea. I have done this qualitative research study on my own. I started asking questions to my friends who were in this 35 to 65 age range. I ended up purchasing books from Amazon and bookstores on qualitative research studies and saying, I'm going to do this myself. I don't know where this project will go, but I'm going to answer the questions that I need answered. And I'm going to help women. And ultimately, that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to get questions answered about menopause and MS and that connection. And I wanted to be able to help women who were facing these difficult challenges in this part of life.
What did you hear from the other women who you were? So how many women did you speak to, first of all? And what were you hearing from them?
I was hearing a lot of the same symptoms and challenges. It varied, I would say, from woman to woman. However, there were some similarities. And the similarities that I can definitely pinpoint were high anxiety. The hot flashes, but it just didn't seem like a menopausal hot flash, which is why everyone was so confused, because we said, well, there's also heat intolerance when you have multiple sclerosis. So most of us, the women that I spoke with, attributed these hot moments to the heat intolerance that we experience. Also, the other two that really, really stuck in my, I would say, just in the back of my mind, and I said, I can't ignore this: depression and the cog fog. Lots of slips of forgetting a word or not being able to remember, just simple, basic sentences or concepts. So those, I would say, the three things that stuck out the most were anxiety, cog fog, or the cognitive slips or deficits, and depression.
Okay, so a strong mental health impact of menopause on MS, um, both of which come with their own sort of mental health challenges, right? I've been through the menopause journey and working full time in a very high pressure job, and you start to feel a little bit like you're losing your mind at times, and you feel like nobody around you understands. And that's just I mean, I have cancer, so the cognitive, as you say, cog fog, that's part and parcel of living with cancer as well, but it's amplified during the menopause period. And so I can totally feel what you're saying in terms of um, wanting to know what is what, and how these two, like basically, how do you manage this transition period? Because it's not just something you have to go through and in 2 weeks it'll be over. It's ongoing, for years. And it's a life transition phase, but you also have to manage your disease during that phase. And you're right, there probably isn't enough information for people who are living with MS on how to, just in normally, I don't think there's enough menopause information. Probably is more now than there has been, but, disease specific menopause information is probably lacking across the board. So you started this project by speaking with women who live with MS. And tell me, because I know the project has moved along quite a bit since then. So tell me a bit where you are now. Where is it now?
So where we are now is working still on the pieces of how we will put together a full IRB approved qualitative research study. Because me as a patient, I am unable to, say that this is a qualitative research study and label it in that sense. And so we recently at the consortium at CMSC, it was held this year in Phoenix, Arizona, we received the Nightingale Award for patient-led research. And that was incredible. And we have a group, I would say about 6 members working on the Women's Health Project. That's what it's titled. And we are seeking partners and seeking funding to help drive this incredible research project, which I feel it's incredible. There's so many pieces here that we can dissect. For example, like you said, the mental health, that's huge. And also the quality of life focus, because so many women in these interviews that I did were speaking about how to manage the day-to-day struggle that they were facing. It really is, it's a reality for us. And it's so challenging some days to decipher, what can I manage? What can I manage? Is it my MS, or is it this menopause or perimenopausal symptom that is occurring in my body? And so where we are now is focusing on, like I said, the overall study and putting that together in a nice package so that it can be IRB approved, and focusing on quality of life and just how women will be able to manage their MS and menopause.
And you are currently working with, as you mentioned, you were working with other partners. Are you happy to share who some of those partners are?
Yes. So I'm currently working with the Accelerated Cure Project. They are a nonprofit organization, and they're based in, I believe, Boston. And we have a key researcher on our team. We also have researchers and postdoc individuals, and a major researcher out of the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I'm trying to think, Yolanda, there are 2 other researchers. One is in Florida, and I've forgotten her university, and another researcher in Virginia. I can pull up their titles if you'd like, but I
No,
don't
that's
know.
okay. That's
Okay.
okay. But you're primarily working with scientists and researchers who are familiar with the IRB research process.
Correct.
And you yourself, I believe, have just done a systematic literature review, haven't you?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So,
And
so you are taking a very sort of scientific and formal approach to this project.
yeah,
Um, and as a patient, I'm certain that you're probably learning loads as you go as well.
I am. So one of the researchers or one of the postdoc individuals on our team, she set it up so that I can do a scoping review of various articles that pertain to women's health. Not all
Hmm.
of the articles discussed menopause or perimenopause. However, they did discuss some aspect of women's health. And so what the goal was to review thousands. I think I reviewed about 7,000 articles. I did a scoping review. Yeah, 7,000. I went through each article, looked at the abstract, and really there was a criteria that was set up. And so I picked which abstract, well, it was two of us really kind of going through it. And so I picked through each one to see what article would be able to provide some assistance in our overall literature review. And
Hmm.
now we are at the full text review portion, and I've just finished that. So we're reading full text reviews and making sure, reviewing the full text and making sure that we can pull really pertinent information that pertain to multiple sclerosis and menopause. We're finding quite a bit of information. However, it's still not enough.
Okay. And it's probably all in language that I'll say normal patients who aren't as educated and knowledgeable as you are, it's probably not in a patient-friendly language where they would feel comfortable reading, scientific publications about menopause to try to get answers. So it's good that you are doing this, and hopefully you can help to simplify some of that research findings as well.
Yes.
Who are you looking for as a partner now?
You know, now we are looking for, it would be amazing to have one of the major organizations like the National Multiple Sclerosis Society in the US. It would be amazing to have pharma, any company that would love to talk about women's health and particularly menopause, I should say, or perimenopause. And if I can interject, HRT
Hmm.
was also brought up. And I do know that hormone replacement was something that a lot of women discussed and were interested in pursuing. Well, I shouldn't say having a discussion with their MS specialist as well as their GYN. They wanted to know how any type of HRT would affect their MS and vice versa.
Hmm.
And so I'm looking to have partners from pharma and from any major MS organization would be amazing to help push this research forward.
Okay. That's good to know. In terms of new partners, I mean, obviously, the biopharma and the pharmaceutical industry who manufacture the MS treatments, it would be amazing to have them involved because you're navigating a space on one of their treatments usually, and so it would be helpful for them to also be able to provide information to people that are taking their treatments about how to navigate that life that life part of your life journey. It's not just something a little, a side effect management, a little bump in the road where you have to kind of navigate around something that is temporary and will go away. It's ongoing and life changing in many ways. So it would be good if we could potentially reach some of those people who are involved in making the innovative treatments to also join your project.
Absolutely.
It brings up another thing, and I know we are close to time on our session today, but it's something that I hear quite frequently from clients that I work with on projects, is that they have this perception that patients are not as knowledgeable as they really are. It's almost like there needs to be a distinction between people like you, so who we would call patient experts, but I found that working with different pharmaceutical companies, the labels change, and so there's not a consistency around what sort of differentiates someone who is just diagnosed and trying to manage their disease, but really doesn't, isn't knowledgeable, couldn't mentor anyone else, doesn't read scientific publications. It's literally like they trust their doctor or whatever their doctor says, but they don't research on their own. So there's a difference for me working with people like that and working with yourself and other patients who are incredible experts and community leaders and, doing things like this research initiation. And I wonder, like, how do we communicate that difference, and so that maybe the healthcare industry and hospitals and all of that feel more collaborative, feel that, like, when a door is open like this one is, that they might actually want to, participate, collaborate, be partners in this type of project.
How do we bridge the gap between the patient experts?
Yes, I mean, that's part of what Merakoi is there for, to bridge that gap between, patient experts like yourself and the industry. But it's almost a changing perception as well, right?
Yes.
Because they see patients as patients, and it's sort of a blanket, it's like in the physician world. All healthcare companies have KOLs or KOIs or whatever they call them these days, where they have their, like, industry leaders. You'll have your neurologist, just your prescribing neurologist, and then you'll have like an expert neurologist that they'll have in a little bucket called a KOL, but they don't really have that same bucket for the most part for patients.
No.
And I find that this is still a challenge, because if I were to talk to a pharmaceutical company client about, working on a patient-initiated research project, some of them would still see that as an impossibility when it's clearly not. Do you know what I mean? They would say, like, oh, patients can't do this. It's I don't know. I still see a barrier there in the perception. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. It's such a good point. I think that it boils down to communication and really having a trust. The trust has been building. I would say it was broken. I would say between patients and that community. But I see that we are bridging this gap, because Merakoi is amazing and is certainly putting us in touch with these industry partners. I think for a very, very long time, patients felt that they were untouchable. There was no way that we could speak with someone in biopharma or pharma. How would we even, have our questions answered? How would we get their attention on what it is that the patients need? And I think now that social media for sure has played a role, I think now that patients aren't, I would say I'm not afraid, but a lot of patients just are not afraid to use their voice and to, like I said, I want questions answered. And I think both sides, eradicating the fear from the patient side and then opening up from the pharma or biopharma or industry side, opening up saying, hey, let's poke the bear here and let's see if we can find out more information. Let's go right to the source, because the source is the patient, if I'm not mistaken.
The source is the patient, and I think historically sometimes the source has been the physician or the MSL, who is their medical science liaison, who goes to the physicians and asks about the patient's voice for certain key areas, so we're going into research and development for this new treatment. They'll go to the MSL will connect with the physicians, and they'll ask about the patient experience, but they're not asking the patients about the patient experience. And this is where I think some of the things, there's a gap clearly. And what you're doing sort of highlights that there is that gap. There's the gap, and the physician cannot speak for the patient any more than you can speak for the physician, right? They can talk about their challenges in managing and treating patients, but they can't really talk about what a patient lives with day to day, and also I find that, having worked now for over 5 years with Merakoi, the experts are really experts. Sometimes they know more than the doctors, which is amazing. And recognizing that, and also just bringing the doctors and nurses and the healthcare industry together, I think it can only be beneficial, right? So,
Absolutely.
if you had a neurologist working with you on your project, and you had the healthcare industry working, a hospital and a biopharma, it would have the outcomes and the publication that come out of this would only strengthen, right?
Yes. And to your point, no one asks patients, how are you experiencing this time of your life? No one asked me. They just said, oh, you may be going through perimenopause. You may be experiencing challenges, but we can give you something to soothe your aches and your ailments. Well, I don't want just a medication. I don't want to be prescribed something. I want to talk this through. I want to understand, why is this happening? I want to understand, is this normal? Am I going crazy? That was another question that a lot of women were asking. Am I going crazy? Am I alone? Well, no, you're not. And so I think in order to really make an impact moving forward is to be able to keep that line of communication open. And I would really love to say to pharma or biopharma or these other industry community members, please tap into the patient experience. Go in and ask us, because I'm sure there are many more like myself that are willing to utilize their voice, their time, their energy, their effort, and really, really focus on getting to, like I said, this is at the crux of the study, a great quality of life. That's so important to us.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to, right? Disease control and good quality of life.
Yeah.
If we can have those things, then we can sort out everything else.